No one heard them coming until the fog started moving the wrong way, as if the world itself had learned to breathe differently in that silent stretch of land where visibility collapsed into nothing but shifting gray and uncertain shapes. Staff Sergeant Marcus Reed stood still at the edge of that emptiness, his boots planted in damp earth that gave no reassurance, only a soft surrender beneath his weight, while around him the remaining members of his Marine squad gathered in tight formation, their silhouettes fading in and out of the dense fog like ghosts trying to remember who they used to be. No one spoke louder than a whisper, not because they were told to be silent, but because the environment itself demanded it, pressing down on every sound until even breathing felt like a decision that carried consequence. Their communication systems had fallen into unreliable silence hours earlier, leaving them without direction from anything beyond their own instincts and fragmented map readings that no longer matched the terrain they stood in. Marcus glanced at Corporal Daniel Hayes, then toward Private First Class Ethan Brooks, and finally Sergeant Kevin Walker, reading the quiet tension in their posture. The way trained discipline had begun to mix with something more human, something closer to uncertainty. The fog was not just weather. It felt alive, swallowing distance, erasing certainty, and bending time into something slower and heavier than it should have been. Somewhere deeper within that pale void, unseen terrain shifted gently under wind that never fully revealed itself, and every direction looked identical, like the world had been stripped of memory. It was then that Ghost appeared. At first, he was not recognized as movement, but as a difference in stillness, a place where the fog seemed reluctant to settle, as though something within it refused to be hidden. The white K9 stepped forward without sound, his coat almost glowing against the gray environment, not with brightness, but with an unnatural clarity, as if he belonged to a different layer of reality that had briefly intersected with theirs. He did not bark, did not circle, did not hesitate. Instead, he stood facing Marcus Reed directly, his amber eyes locked with a focus that felt less like instinct and more like recognition. Marcus felt it immediately, a shift in the air that had nothing to do with wind or weather, but with certainty forming where none had existed a moment before. Behind him, Kevin Walker muttered under his breath that trusting movement in conditions like this was reckless, that even trained animals could lose orientation when the environment turned against them. But Marcus did not answer, because something in Ghost's presence cut through doubt in a way logic could not reach. The K9 turned his head slightly, just once, toward the deeper fog, then back again, as if confirming that the path he intended to take was not chosen randomly, but understood with purpose beyond explanation. Slowly, Marcus lifted his hand, signaling the squad to follow, not because he had full confidence, but because standing still had already become its own kind of risk in a place where certainty no longer existed. They moved as one unit, carefully, step by step, following the white K9 as he slipped into the fog ahead of them, his form appearing and disappearing like a thread being pulled through fabric too thick to see through. Each member of the squad adjusted their pace to his rhythm, noticing how he avoided certain ground without hesitation, how he paused briefly at points where the air felt different, as if listening to something none of them could hear. Time lost structure as they advanced, minutes blending together until it felt like they were walking through the same moment repeated in different shades of gray. Marcus kept his eyes fixed forward, trusting not the environment, not the fading coordinates, but the steady, unexplainable certainty of the white K9 leading them through the unknown. And in that silence, deeper than any command or instruction, something unspoken settled across the squad. They were no longer navigating the fog alone. The deeper they moved into the fog, the more the world seemed to lose its structure, as if the land itself had been erased and replaced with a shifting void that offered no confirmation of direction or distance. Marcus Reed kept his focus on the white K9 ahead of them, the only consistent presence in a place where everything else dissolved into uncertainty. Behind him, the squad maintained formation, but their spacing tightened instinctively, each man relying on proximity more than sight, because sight had become unreliable. Corporal Daniel Hayes checked his compass twice, then a third time, only to find that the needle seemed hesitant, as if it could not decide what truth to follow. Private First Class Ethan Brooks stayed close to Marcus, his breathing controlled but deliberate, while Sergeant Kevin Walker kept scanning the fog with slow, measured movements that suggested a mind working through possibilities that were not yet spoken aloud. The white K9, Ghost, did not slow down. Instead, he adjusted his pace with precise awareness, pausing briefly at subtle changes in ground texture, then continuing forward with an unshakable sense of direction that felt unnatural in such a disorienting environment. At one point, he stopped completely, head angled slightly, as if listening to something buried beneath the silence. The squad froze with him, instinctively responding to his stillness as though it carried meaning beyond animal behavior. Marcus stepped closer, lowering his voice, though there was no expectation that sound would carry far in the dense fog. Kevin Walker finally spoke, suggesting that relying entirely on a single path indicator in such conditions carried risk, especially when visibility remained near zero and terrain markers could not be confirmed. Marcus did not respond immediately, because something about Ghost's posture held his attention more than the uncertainty around them. The white K9 turned his head slightly, not toward Marcus this time, but toward a faint shift in the environment ahead, where the fog seemed to ripple in a way that did not match natural movement. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to suggest that something within the terrain had changed. Marcus raised his hand again, signaling the squad to remain steady, and they obeyed without hesitation. As they advanced once more, the atmosphere grew heavier, not in a physical sense, but in a psychological one, as if the fog itself had begun to compress their awareness into narrower and narrower focus. Ghost moved through it like a fixed point in a drifting world, never rushing, never hesitating, always choosing paths that avoided confusion rather than confronting it. The squad began to notice patterns in his behavior, how he adjusted direction not randomly, but in response to unseen cues, as though he was interpreting signals they could not perceive. At intervals, he would pause and look back briefly at Marcus Reed, ensuring they were still following, before continuing forward. It was during one of these pauses that Kevin Walker quietly mentioned the possibility of external interference, not in a threatening sense, but in the sense that something might be altering perception or disrupting navigational consistency. Marcus considered this without confirming or denying it, because the fog itself already behaved in ways that defied expectation. The terrain began to subtly shift in character, from open stretches to tighter passages, from soft ground to firmer surfaces that suggested they were approaching a transition zone. Ghost slowed again, this time more deliberately, and the squad instinctively matched his pace. Ahead, the fog appeared to thin slightly, not fully clearing but allowing faint outlines of elevation changes and distant structures that could not yet be identified. Marcus felt a shift in tension, not as fear, but as anticipation, the sense that they were approaching something significant without knowing its exact nature. The white K9 remained calm, but his posture changed subtly, becoming more alert, more anchored, as if confirming that the path he had chosen was nearing completion. Behind him, the squad tightened formation once more, preparing not for confrontation, but for emergence from uncertainty into whatever lay beyond it. And as they moved forward together, the fog began to feel less like an obstacle and more like a threshold, holding its breath as they crossed through it. The fog began to lose its uniform density as the squad continued forward, not disappearing but changing its character in subtle, almost unexplainable ways. Thinning in uneven waves that revealed fragments of terrain like a memory returning in broken pieces. Marcus Reed noticed it first in the way Ghost adjusted his pace, no longer navigating purely by instinct, but responding to something that seemed to exist just beyond human perception. The white K9 moved with increasing certainty, his steps steady and deliberate, as if the environment ahead had become clearer to him long before it became visible to the men following behind. Corporal Daniel Hayes lowered his voice to a near whisper, mentioning that the air felt different here, less compressed, as though they were crossing an invisible boundary separating confusion from structure. Private First Class Ethan Brooks scanned the horizon carefully, but all he could see were faint gradients of gray shifting into lighter tones, suggesting openness, but not yet confirming safety. Sergeant Kevin Walker adjusted his gear and looked down at his handheld navigation device, only to find that it continued to provide inconsistent readings, fluctuating between positions as if struggling to stabilize. Marcus did not rely on it anymore. His attention remained fixed on Ghost, whose presence had become the only constant reference point in a world that refused to behave predictably. As they moved further, faint outlines began to emerge within the fog, suggesting elevation changes, open ground, and possibly a transition toward a clearing beyond the dense atmospheric layer they had been trapped in for what felt like far longer than measured time. Ghost slowed again, this time pausing at a slight incline where the ground shifted from soft soil to firmer packed earth, and he turned his head slowly, as if confirming alignment with something unseen but deeply understood. Marcus raised his hand, signaling the squad to halt, and for a moment everything became still except for the subtle movement of fog drifting past their boots. In that stillness, Kevin Walker spoke again, noting that there were faint auditory distortions in the distance, not voices, but irregular patterns of sound that did not match natural wind or terrain interaction. Marcus listened carefully, but what he heard was not sound. In the traditional sense, rather a sensation of structure returning to the environment, like the world itself remembering how to organize space. Ghost stepped forward once more, and the squad followed, now moving with a cautious rhythm that balanced trust and awareness. The fog continued to thin, revealing more consistent shapes ahead, including what appeared to be a wide opening where the terrain flattened and extended outward, suggesting a clearing large enough for regrouping or extraction. Marcus felt a subtle shift in his shoulders, not relief yet, but something close to it, the kind of tension that loosens only when the mind begins to accept that uncertainty is finally giving way to possibility. The white K9 paused at the edge of this opening, standing perfectly still as if evaluating not the physical space, but what it represented. His ears remained forward, his posture alert but no longer urgent, indicating that the immediate navigation challenge had reached a point of resolution. Behind him, the squad gathered closer, their formation tightening instinctively as they transitioned from movement through uncertainty to observation of open ground. The fog still lingered in patches around the edges of the clearing, but it no longer dominated the environment, allowing brief glimpses of distant silhouettes and stable terrain features that confirmed they were no longer fully disoriented. Marcus stepped forward slowly, joining Ghost at the edge, and for the first time since entering the fog zone, he could see a horizon that felt structurally real rather than imagined. Yet even in this moment of partial clarity, Ghost remained focused, his attention directed slightly downward and forward, as if anticipating something that had not yet revealed itself but was already in motion within the broader environment. The squad remained silent, not from fear, but from the instinctive understanding that transitions of this kind often carried unseen complexity. Marcus placed a steady hand near Ghost's shoulder level without touching him, acknowledging the role he had played without breaking the focus that still held the moment together. And as the last layers of fog drifted slowly away from the clearing, the world beyond began to take shape with a clarity that felt both relieving and uncertain, as if the journey was not ending, but simply entering a new phase that required an entirely different kind of awareness. As the last layers of fog drifted behind them, the clearing ahead finally revealed itself in full structure rather than fragments, and the change in environment felt immediate, almost like stepping from one world into another that obeyed different rules of clarity and distance. Marcus Reed slowed his pace beside Ghost, his eyes scanning the open terrain carefully, taking in the wider visibility, the stable ground, and the faint outlines of distant ridgelines that confirmed they had successfully exited the densest part of the fog zone. Behind him, Corporal Daniel Hayes and Private First Class Ethan Brooks spread out slightly for situational awareness, their posture shifting from tight survival formation to controlled assessment of surroundings, while Sergeant Kevin Walker kept his attention moving in measured arcs, verifying that no immediate threats or obstacles were present within visual range. The air here felt lighter, less compressed, and even sound behaved differently, carrying further without distortion, as if the environment had been restored to a natural state after hours of disorientation. Ghost remained at Marcus Reed's side but did not fully relax. Instead, his stance held a quiet alertness, ears forward, eyes tracking subtle movements across the open space, as if confirming that their transition out of the fog had not yet fully concluded. Marcus noticed this immediately, because the white canine's behavior had become the most reliable indicator of environmental truth throughout their entire movement. Kevin Walker adjusted his position and mentioned that visibility extended approximately several hundred yards in most directions, though exact confirmation remained difficult due to lingering mist patches along the perimeter of the clearing. Ethan Brooks exhaled slowly, the first visible sign of tension release since they had entered the fog zone, though his eyes continued to scan the horizon out of habit rather than necessity. Marcus raised his hand slightly, signaling the squad to hold position while he evaluated the situation with Ghost. The white K9 stepped forward a few feet, then stopped again at a precise point where the ground leveled completely, and he turned his head toward Marcus with a calm intensity that suggested the critical portion of their movement had been completed. Marcus crouched slightly, bringing himself closer to Ghost's level, observing the dog's posture carefully, noticing how his breathing had become heavier but steady, as if he had maintained sustained focus far beyond normal exertion. The squad gathered behind Marcus in a loose semicircle, maintaining awareness but no longer in active navigation mode, their attention divided between the surrounding terrain and the K9 that had guided them through conditions that had defied conventional orientation. For a moment, there was silence, not the oppressive silence of the fog zone, but a natural quiet shaped by open space and stable air. Marcus placed a hand near Ghost's shoulder again, this time gently, acknowledging the role he had played without disrupting the calm focus that still held the animal's attention. Ghost responded by remaining still, his gaze fixed forward, not on Marcus or the squad, but on the distant edge of the clearing where the terrain subtly shifted into another layer of uncertainty beyond immediate sight. Kevin Walker noticed it too and mentioned that the perimeter still showed intermittent fog movement, suggesting that conditions beyond the clearing had not fully stabilized. Marcus considered this information carefully, understanding that while they had reached a safer zone, the environment still demanded caution and structured planning before further movement. Ethan Brooks checked his equipment and confirmed that their positioning relative to known reference points was improving, though still not fully synchronized with digital mapping systems. Marcus looked out across the clearing once more, absorbing the scale of space around them. The way the fog now lingered only at the edges like a fading boundary rather than an enclosing force. Ghost finally shifted his stance slightly, lowering his head just a fraction, signaling that the immediate objective had been achieved, but his continued alertness suggested awareness of responsibilities beyond the present moment. The squad remained gathered, no longer driven by urgency, but by evaluation, as the environment settled into a stable but unfamiliar calm. And in that quiet openness, Marcus Reed understood that while they had escaped the uncertainty of the fog, the experience had fundamentally changed the way they would move through anything that came after it, because trust had been redefined not by systems or instruments, but by the steady presence of a white K9 who had guided them through when everything else had failed. The clearing had settled into a fragile kind of calm, the kind that never fully removes tension but instead spreads it out evenly so it becomes easier to miss. Marcus Reed stood near the center of the formation, his attention alternating between the white K9 and the distant edges of the terrain, where faint remnants of fog still clung to low ground like reluctant memory. Ghost remained in front of him, no longer leading forward with urgency, but holding position with quiet alertness that suggested the mission had not ended so much as transitioned into a new phase. Behind them, Corporal Daniel Hayes adjusted his gear and slowly scanned the open space again, this time with a more deliberate rhythm, while Private First Class Ethan Brooks kept his eyes moving across the horizon line, tracking subtle shifts in light and distance that confirmed stability but not full certainty. Sergeant Kevin Walker checked his compass once more out of habit rather than necessity, then lowered it, acknowledging that the environment here no longer behaved like the one they had just escaped. Marcus exhaled slowly, letting his posture relax slightly, though his awareness never left Ghost, whose presence still carried the same silent intensity that had guided them through the fog. The white K9 took a few slow steps forward, then stopped again, this time turning his head toward Marcus as if confirming that the immediate danger phase was complete. There was something different in his stillness now, not exhaustion exactly, but the quiet resolution of a task fully carried out beyond expectation. Marcus knelt slightly beside him, studying the dog's breathing, noticing the controlled rise and fall of his chest, the subtle tremor in his stance that suggested sustained effort over time. Kevin Walker mentioned that the extraction point should be within reasonable distance if they maintained a direct line across the clearing, and Ethan Brooks confirmed visual markers consistent with map terrain overlays beginning to reappear on his device. Marcus nodded once, absorbing the information, but his attention remained partially anchored to Ghost, who had not yet fully disengaged from alert posture. The white K9 suddenly shifted his gaze toward the far edge of the clearing, where the last fragments of fog lingered like torn fabric caught between wind and ground. His ears lifted slightly, not in alarm, but in attentive recognition, as if acknowledging something that still required awareness even after passage through the most difficult section. Marcus followed that gaze instinctively, scanning the same direction, but saw only distance and light variation across uneven terrain. Still, he trusted the signal, because every decision they had made since entering the fog zone had ultimately aligned with Ghost's perception rather than their instruments. The squad remained loosely positioned behind him, their formation no longer rigid but still disciplined, reflecting a shift from survival urgency to operational reassessment. Kevin Walker commented quietly that environmental readings were stabilizing across multiple indicators, though minor anomalies persisted near the perimeter edges, suggesting residual atmospheric disruption rather than active threat. Marcus processed the information but did not respond immediately, instead observing the way Ghost subtly adjusted his stance again, shifting weight from one front paw to the other in a controlled motion that indicated continued engagement with surroundings rather than rest. The clearing itself felt larger now that their perception had adjusted, its boundaries no longer oppressive but open, allowing distance to exist without distortion. Yet even in this openness, Marcus understood that clarity did not necessarily equal completion. He placed a steady hand near Ghost's shoulder once more, acknowledging both the end of the immediate journey and the possibility that the environment beyond still held unknown variables. Ghost did not react strongly to the contact, but remained steady, his focus still directed outward, as if ensuring that the path behind them was truly safe for those who had followed him through uncertainty. Behind Marcus, Ethan Brooks finally allowed a deeper breath, his shoulders lowering slightly as the sustained tension of navigation eased into controlled awareness. Corporal Daniel Hayes looked toward the horizon line and remarked softly that it felt like they had crossed more than just terrain, though he did not elaborate further. Marcus understood what he meant without needing clarification. The white K9 had not simply led them through fog. He had maintained alignment when all reference points had failed, and now stood at the threshold between movement and completion, still watching, still ensuring, as if responsibility had not yet been fully released. And as the squad remained in that open space, surrounded by thinning remnants of gray at the edges of their world, the quiet realization settled in that what they had experienced would remain with them not as an event they survived, but as a standard by which every future moment of uncertainty would be measured. The open terrain around them had settled into a steady silence, the kind that does not feel empty, but instead feels carefully balanced, as if the world is holding its breath after a long moment of uncertainty. Marcus Reed remained near Ghost, his posture now more relaxed but still attentive, aware that transitions like this often carried delayed consequences rather than immediate resolution. The white K9 stood at his side, no longer actively scanning forward, but still maintaining a quiet vigilance that suggested his responsibility had not fully ended. Behind them, Corporal Daniel Hayes and Private First Class Ethan Brooks slowly shifted their spacing, widening their formation slightly as operational awareness replaced the tight survival clustering they had maintained in the fog. Sergeant Kevin Walker checked his surroundings again, this time with a more natural rhythm, confirming that visual stability and terrain consistency had returned to acceptable levels for standard movement. Marcus exhaled slowly, letting the weight of continuous tension ease from his shoulders, though his focus never fully left Ghost, whose presence remained central to everything that had brought them through the fog zone intact. The white K9 took one slow step forward, then stopped again, his head angled slightly downward, as if listening to something beneath the surface of the environment that others could not perceive. Marcus noticed this immediately, recognizing the subtle difference between rest and continued awareness. Kevin Walker mentioned that extraction protocols should now be within standard operational parameters, with updated coordinates aligning to their current position after recalibration. Ethan Brooks confirmed that satellite positioning had regained stability, though minor fluctuations still appeared along the edges of their mapped perimeter, suggesting that the fog zone had disrupted systems more deeply than initially assumed. Marcus acknowledged the information without verbal response, his attention instead drawn to the way Ghost shifted his weight slightly, maintaining readiness even in apparent calm. The squad began to move slowly forward across the clearing, no longer in defensive formation, but in coordinated progression, each man maintaining awareness of distance and alignment as they approached what now appeared to be a gradual slope leading toward more defined terrain. Ghost remained at the front, but his pace had softened, transitioning from guidance to accompaniment, as though confirming that the critical phase of navigation had already been completed. The air itself felt different here, lighter and more structured, allowing sound to travel with clarity rather than distortion, and Marcus could hear the subtle rhythm of their own movement more distinctly than at any point since entering the fog. At one moment, Ghost paused again, turning his head toward Marcus with a calm, steady gaze that carried no urgency but held undeniable meaning. Marcus stopped as well, interpreting the gesture not as warning but as final confirmation that the path behind them had been successfully resolved. Corporal Daniel Hayes looked around once more, remarking quietly that it felt like they had crossed a boundary that could not be measured on any standard map, a transition defined more by experience than geography. Kevin Walker nodded in agreement, noting that environmental readings had fully stabilized across all available indicators, though residual anomalies persisted at extreme distances beyond their current field of view. Marcus absorbed this information and looked across the open terrain once more, recognizing that while immediate uncertainty had passed, the broader environment still retained layers of unpredictability that would require continued awareness. Ghost stood beside him, no longer moving forward, but no longer retreating either, positioned exactly between action and rest, as if completing a responsibility that extended beyond simple navigation. The squad gathered loosely behind Marcus, their posture now fully relaxed but still attentive, reflecting the shift from survival intensity to operational closure. Marcus placed a final steady hand near Ghost's shoulder, acknowledging not only what had been accomplished, but the sustained focus required to achieve it under conditions that had denied conventional guidance. The white K-9 remained still, accepting the gesture without shifting his gaze from the horizon, where the terrain stretched forward into clarity that now felt stable but unfamiliar. And as the group stood together in that open space, fully beyond the fog, yet still shaped by what it had taken to pass through it, there was a shared understanding that the experience had not ended with escape, but had instead redefined the meaning of trust in moments where nothing else could be relied upon. The squad continued forward across the stabilized terrain, moving in a controlled line that reflected both discipline and the quiet release of tension that follows prolonged uncertainty. Marcus Reed led slightly ahead of the formation, with Ghost now walking beside him rather than in front, as if the role of navigation had transitioned into something more subtle, more shared. The white K-9's pace was steady, unhurried, and his posture no longer carried urgency, but it retained a level of awareness that suggested he was still processing the environment in ways beyond human interpretation. Behind them, Corporal Daniel Hayes maintained a slow scan of the horizon, while Private First Class Ethan Brooks adjusted his breathing pattern to match the calmer pace of movement, and Sergeant Kevin Walker periodically checked their orientation relative to known coordinates, confirming that their direction remained consistent with extraction guidance. The air felt fully restored now, carrying normal sound behavior and stable visibility that extended far into the distance, revealing rolling terrain and distant markers that had been completely hidden inside the fog zone. Marcus observed Ghost carefully as they moved, noting how the white K-9 occasionally paused for only a fraction of a second before continuing, as if confirming invisible checkpoints that ensured their path remained correct even beyond the point of immediate danger. The squad crossed a gradual incline where the ground shifted from compact soil to a slightly rockier surface, and here Ghost finally slowed, stopping at a natural break in elevation where the terrain opened further into a wide, unobstructed field. Marcus stopped beside him, turning his attention outward across the landscape, recognizing that this position offered a full visual corridor extending in multiple directions, a clear contrast to the compressed disorientation they had endured earlier. Kevin Walker confirmed that they were now within standard range of extraction support, with environmental readings fully stable and no remaining anomalies detected within operational radius. Ethan Brooks exhaled again, this time with a visible sense of relief, his shoulders lowering as the sustained pressure of uncertainty finally gave way to functional awareness. Ghost remained still, his attention forward, but his posture now lacked urgency, replaced instead by a quiet steadiness that suggested the task he had carried was nearing completion. Marcus knelt slightly beside him, studying the white K9's condition more closely, noticing the subtle signs of fatigue that had been masked during the intensity of navigation, the controlled breathing, the focused gaze, and the minimal but continuous effort required to maintain alignment through conditions that had overwhelmed human perception. The squad gathered loosely behind Marcus once more, no longer in formation driven by survival necessity, but in a relaxed operational stance that allowed for reflection and assessment. The landscape around them remained calm, with distant movement of wind across open ground creating a natural rhythm that replaced the unnatural silence of the fog zone. Ghost shifted his head slightly toward Marcus, making brief eye contact before returning his focus outward, as if acknowledging both presence and responsibility without requiring further confirmation. Marcus placed a steady hand near the white K9's shoulder, not to direct, but to acknowledge, understanding that what had occurred was not simply guidance through terrain, but a sustained act of trust under conditions where trust itself had been the only reliable structure available. Sergeant Kevin Walker commented quietly that the experience would likely require formal debriefing, not because of tactical failure, but because of the unusual reliability of non-instrumental navigation under extreme environmental distortion. Marcus did not respond immediately, his attention still anchored to Ghost, who stood calmly in place, now fully settled but still observant, as if ensuring that no final uncertainty remained unresolved. Ethan Brooks looked across the field and noted how strange it felt that clarity could emerge so suddenly after prolonged disorientation, as if the environment had reset itself without warning. Marcus finally rose from his crouch, taking a slow breath as he surveyed the open terrain, recognizing that while the immediate mission objective had been met, the deeper significance of the experience extended beyond simple extraction or survival metrics. Ghost remained at his side, no longer leading, no longer following, but simply present, a constant point of certainty in a sequence of events defined by uncertainty. And as the squad stood together in that wide, stable landscape, fully removed from the fog, yet still shaped by its memory, there was an unspoken understanding that some forms of guidance do not end when the path is found, but continue to exist as a reminder of how fragile direction becomes when certainty disappears. The squad remained in the open terrain, holding position as the environment around them settled into a steady calm that felt almost unfamiliar after the prolonged uncertainty of the fog zone. Marcus Reed stood near Ghost, his attention divided between the horizon and the white K9 who had not moved for several moments. The air was clear, visibility extended far in every direction, and the landscape now appeared fully stable, with gentle elevation changes and distant markers confirming that they were within confirmed extraction range. Corporal Daniel Hayes adjusted his gear and looked toward the far distance where faint movement suggested incoming support was approaching their coordinates. Private First Class Ethan Brooks shaded his eyes briefly, confirming a distant shape in the sky that resolved slowly into a transport aircraft on approach, its presence steady and controlled rather than urgent. Sergeant Kevin Walker verified the signal on his communication device, now fully restored, and confirmed that the extraction unit had acknowledged their position and was minutes away from visual contact. Marcus acknowledged this without turning away from Ghost, whose posture had changed subtly, no longer fully alert in the operational sense, but still present in a way that suggested deep awareness of everything around him. The white K9 lowered himself slightly, shifting weight from standing to a resting position that was controlled rather than abrupt, as if the sustained effort of guiding through the fog had finally reached its natural conclusion. Marcus immediately crouched beside him, placing a steady hand near his shoulder and then gently along his side, noticing the controlled but heavier breathing that reflected prolonged exertion under extreme environmental strain. Ghost did not resist the contact, but his focus remained outward for a moment longer, as if ensuring that nothing remained unresolved in the space they had crossed. The distant aircraft grew closer, its sound gradually becoming more defined as it entered the final approach path, and the squad instinctively adjusted their positions to prepare for extraction procedures. Ethan Brooks signaled readiness while Kevin Walker confirmed final coordinates, and Daniel Hayes maintained visual awareness of the perimeter. Marcus remained focused on Ghost, who now fully lowered himself to the ground in a calm and deliberate motion, settling into rest without distress, but clearly showing signs of exhaustion that had been held back during the entire navigation effort. The white K9's eyes remained open, tracking Marcus briefly before shifting again toward the horizon, where the last traces of fog could still be seen far in the distance like a fading boundary between two different states of the environment. Marcus spoke softly, not as command but as acknowledgement, his voice steady and controlled as he remained beside the dog who had carried them through uncertainty that no instrument had been able to resolve. The aircraft descended into view, maintaining stable alignment with the clearing, its presence marking the final phase of their transition from isolated navigation to confirmed recovery. As it touched down at a safe distance, the squad moved into standard extraction formation, but Marcus paused for a moment longer, staying with Ghost as the rotor wash began to shift the grass around them in steady waves. Medical personnel began to approach from the transport, moving with measured urgency but calm procedure, their focus immediately drawn to the white K9 resting on the ground. Marcus rose only when necessary, stepping aside to allow access while still remaining within arm's reach. The medic knelt near Ghost, performing a quick but careful assessment, confirming stable condition and clear signs of fatigue consistent with sustained operational exertion. Ghost responded only by lifting his head slightly, acknowledging presence without tension, then lowering it again as if accepting rest without resistance. Marcus exhaled slowly, looking across the clearing once more as the rest of the squad prepared to board the extraction transport. Kevin Walker gave a final confirmation that all personnel were accounted for, while Ethan Brooks glanced back briefly at Ghost before stepping toward the aircraft. Daniel Hayes followed, maintaining formation discipline even in transition. Marcus remained for a final moment beside the white K9, placing a steady hand along his shoulder one last time before standing fully. The aircraft's presence filled the space with controlled noise and movement, signaling closure to the operation that had begun in uncertainty and ended in clarity. As Marcus finally turned toward extraction, Ghost remained resting in the open field, calm and stable under the supervision of medical personnel, his role complete, but his presence still felt in the quiet space between wind and horizon. And as the squad moved away from the clearing, there was a shared understanding that what had guided them was not only a path through fog, but a reminder of how trust can remain steady even when every other system fails. The aircraft lifted slowly from the open terrain, its steady ascent marking the final separation between the squad and the ground that had held them through uncertainty. And as the distance increased, the clearing below became smaller until it blended into the broader landscape that now appeared calm and fully stable. Inside the transport, Marcus Reed sat in silence for a moment, his posture steady but reflective, while around him Corporal Daniel Hayes, Private First Class Ethan Brooks, and Sergeant Kevin Walker secured their positions for the return transit, each man still carrying the quiet mental weight of what had just taken place. The interior hum of the aircraft was consistent and grounding, a sharp contrast to the distorted silence they had experienced earlier, and for the first time in hours, Marcus allowed himself to fully release the constant operational tension that had defined their movement through the fog zone. Kevin Walker reviewed final extraction confirmation on his device, noting that all systems had returned to normal function and that environmental anomalies previously recorded were no longer present within the region. Ethan Brooks leaned back slightly, looking down at his gear, as if processing the transition from uncertainty to resolution in stages rather than all at once, while Daniel Hayes remained focused on the rear of the aircraft, where the external view gradually faded into distance. Marcus, however, was not fully focused on the present interior of the aircraft. His thoughts remained anchored to the moment in the clearing where Ghost had finally rested, the white K9 who had carried them through conditions that had stripped away every reliable system they had depended on. The memory was not one of spectacle, but of consistency under pressure, of steady presence in a space where disorientation had been total. The aircraft continued its steady flight path, and the landscape below transitioned from open terrain to structured environment, indicating they were moving back toward controlled airspace and established operational zones. As the minutes passed, the squad began to settle into the post-mission phase of awareness, where adrenaline no longer dictated perception and reflection began to take its place. Marcus finally spoke in a calm, measured tone, not addressing any one individual specifically, but acknowledging the shared experience they had all just passed through. He noted that what had allowed them to move through the fog was not technology or planning alone, but the ability to follow a consistent point of trust when everything else had failed to provide orientation. The others did not immediately respond, not out of disagreement, but because the statement matched a realization they had each already begun to reach independently. Kevin Walker eventually nodded, confirming quietly that certain conditions encountered during the mission would likely be studied further due to their impact on navigation reliability and human perception under extreme environmental interference. Ethan Brooks added that the experience had changed his understanding of situational awareness, particularly in environments where standard instruments could no longer be fully relied upon. Marcus listened without interruption, his attention occasionally drifting back to the memory of Ghost, resting calmly in the clearing under medical observation, not as an image of exhaustion, but as a reminder of sustained effort without hesitation. The aircraft continued its steady return, and the light outside gradually shifted, indicating they were nearing familiar territory where communication systems and operational support would be fully restored. As they approached the landing zone, Marcus felt a quiet sense of closure that did not erase what had happened, but instead organized it into something meaningful rather than chaotic. When the aircraft finally touched down, the movement was smooth and controlled, and the squad prepared to disembark with standard discipline. Outside, ground personnel were already in position, ready to receive them and begin standard post-mission procedures. Marcus stepped out first, followed by the others, each moving with calm precision that reflected both training and the emotional processing of what they had experienced. As he walked across the landing area, Marcus paused briefly, looking back toward the aircraft before turning his attention forward. There was no dramatic conclusion, no need for explanation beyond what had already been understood in silence. What remained was not the fog they had escaped, but the memory of how direction had been restored when visibility had failed completely. And in that final moment of reflection, Marcus understood that some forms of guidance do not end when the mission is complete, because they remain within those who experienced it, shaping how trust is given, how uncertainty is faced, and how silence itself can sometimes become the most reliable form of communication when everything else has disappeared.